The auctioneer's hammer came down like a verdict. "Sold," said the man at the front of the room, and his voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed a record. "To His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, for 460 guineas. The room erupted, not loudly, but in the careful, restrained way of people who understood that erupting loudly would mark them as people who were surprised. Lords shifted in their chairs. A viscountess pressed her fingers to her lips. 3 men in the second row turned to look at the Duke, and the Duke looked at nothing except the painting, which hung at the front of Ryland's auction house on a wall of cream-painted plaster, lit by 4 lamps arranged to show it to best advantage. The painting was of a woman seated at a writing table. She was not beautiful in the way the room understood beauty. She was not arranged in the soft classical poses that sold portraits in London in the year 1818. She sat with her back straight and her hand resting on an open ledger, and she was looking slightly past the painter's shoulder, as though she had heard something in the next room that required her attention. Her dress was plain. Her expression was concentrated. She looked like someone in the middle of useful work. She had been painted, the catalogue noted, by one Thomas Hartley, deceased, commissioned by the late Arthur Pembury of Pemberton, Oxfordshire, in the year 1814. No additional information was provided. No sitter was named. The catalogue had not mentioned that the sitter was currently standing against the back wall of Ryland's auction house, wearing her second-best gray dress, and holding a program she had folded and unfolded until its edges were soft. Her name was Eleanor Pembury, and she was watching the Duke of Ashford look at a portrait of herself with the expression of a man identifying something he did not yet fully understand. She had learned, by the time she was 22, not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She was 28 now, and she understood auctions. She understood that the painting had belonged, on her father's death, to the estate, and that the estate had passed, on the terms of her father's will, to her cousin Gerald, and that Gerald had determined last spring that the contents of the house were to be sold to address the accumulation of debt that Gerald himself had created in the 4 years he had held the estate's management, or what passed for management, while Eleanor had been reassigned to the role of invisible administrator, which was another way of saying that she had run everything and received nothing, not even the credit. She had come to the auction because Gerald had not told her the portrait would be included in the sale. She had come because a footman at the London house, a young man named Davies who had known her since she was 12, had sent a note to her lodgings in Marylebone, informing her that the painting was in the catalogue, Lot 41, estimated at 30 to 50 guineas. She had come because her father had commissioned that portrait, and because the woman sitting at that writing table was her, painted by a man who had understood that the ledger was not a prop but the whole point, and because she had nowhere else for the painting to go, and because she could not afford 30 guineas, let alone 460, and she had known she would not be able to afford it before she arrived, and she had come anyway. The Duke of Ashford was still looking at the painting. He had not moved from his chair. Around him, the room reorganized itself into the familiar choreography of post-sale admiration, people drifting toward him, people angling to be noticed, and he sat through it with the patience of a man who had long ago stopped pretending that drift was interesting. Eleanor pressed the folded program flat against her palm and turned toward the exit. She had reached the door when she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Pembury." She stopped. She turned, because to do otherwise would have been discourteous, and also because she was curious, despite every piece of good sense she possessed. The Duke of Ashford was crossing the room toward her, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who expected the room to accommodate him, which it did, chairs moving, people stepping back, without his asking. He was tall, he wore a dark coat with no ornamentation, and he carried authority the way good architecture carries weight, so evenly distributed that you almost did not notice it until you looked for how it worked. "I am afraid," he said when he had reached her, "that you have the advantage of me. I know your name from the estate records, but I do not know how you came to be here this evening." Eleanor looked at him. He was perhaps 35, and he had dark eyes that did not settle in the way of men who were performing their own intelligence. They settled precisely on exactly what they were examining. Currently, they were examining her, and not with the assessment that most rooms gave her, which was the assessment of a woman who was adequately dressed, and therefore adequately ignorable. "I might ask," she said, "how you know my name from estate records at all, Your Grace." He considered this. "A fair point," he said. "Would you do me the courtesy of remaining for a few minutes? There is a matter I would like to discuss with you that is rather more practical than the sale that just concluded." The room was watching. 3 women in particular were watching with the specific attention of people cataloging an irregularity. Eleanor noted this and also noted that the Duke showed no indication of caring. "I would require," she said, "some explanation of the subject before I agreed to anything." "Naturally," he said. "I purchased a portrait of someone who appears to have been running an estate in Oxfordshire for the last 4 years with considerable skill. I find I am in need of exactly that kind of skill, and I have not found it through the ordinary channels." The subject of the portrait seemed an appropriate starting point. He said it the way he might have said he had purchased a useful map. Eleanor looked at him with the particular stillness of someone filing information away before responding. "You have not," she said, "even asked if I am the person in the painting." "You have the same posture," he said simply, "and the same expression." The painter was accurate about the expression particularly. She returned to her ledger the following morning, the one she kept herself, in her 2 rooms in Marylebone, recording what she spent and what she had, and what she would need for the next 3 months. She had managed larger accounts than this. The habit of precision was the one thing that had not been taken from her. Eleanor Pembury had grown up in a house that ran well because she made it run well, which was not a thing her father would have said, and was not a thing she said herself, because saying it aloud required the kind of accounting that her world did not encourage women to conduct in public. Her father, Arthur Pembury of Pemberton, had been a gentle, well-intentioned man, with a moderate estate and a habit of believing that things would arrange themselves satisfactorily if approached with sufficient goodwill. For most of Eleanor's childhood, this had been approximately correct, because her mother had arranged them. When her mother died, Eleanor was 15. The arranging fell to Eleanor, and Arthur Pembury had not precisely assigned her this role, but he had not prevented it either. And within 8 months, Eleanor was managing the household accounts, the staff, the creditor correspondence, and the seasonal ordering, and her father had continued to approach all of this with sufficient goodwill and the sincere belief that the house ran well because it was a good house. She did not resent him for it. That had been a decision she made deliberately at 17, when she understood the alternative, that resentment would consume the hours she needed for work, and the work was not going to do itself. By the time Eleanor was 19, she was negotiating with the wool merchants directly, not because she had been given authority to do so, but because the tenant farmers had brought their concerns to the house, and her father had been in London, and Eleanor had sat down with the 3 men at the kitchen table and gone through the figures with them, and arrived at an agreement that had saved the season's margin. When her father returned, she showed him the agreement. He read it and said it seemed quite sensible, and did she want to stay in London some day, it might be arranged. And then he had put the document in his correspondence box, and Eleanor had taken her copy to the estate files, which she maintained in a system of her own design. The system had 37 categories. She had built it over 4 years, and in the 5 years after that, it had produced enough organization that she could identify discrepancies in a quarter day's worth of accounts, in the time it took most estate managers to find the right ledger. Then her father had died. She was 24. The will, which Arthur Pembury had written with the sincere belief that Gerald Pembury was a sensible young man, which had also been true once, or at least approximately, had left the estate to her father's nephew, with a provision for Eleanor's maintenance. Gerald had arrived within a fortnight, full of good intentions and the confidence of someone who had heard the word estate and thought of capital rather than labor. He had looked at the filing system and called it thorough. He had looked at Eleanor and called her invaluable. He had then proceeded to make 4 significant financial decisions in his first 6 months, none of which he had discussed with Eleanor, and all of which she had subsequently spent 18 months quietly repairing. She had remained because the alternative was her cousin Harriet's household in Bath, where she would have been the poor relation assigned to read aloud to an elderly aunt in the afternoons, and she had determined at 22 that she was not going to become less than she was for the convenience of a situation that did not deserve her. So she stayed. She managed. She sent the creditor letters and renegotiated the merchant terms and kept Gerald's cheerful incompetence from destroying what her father had built, and Gerald called her invaluable and raised her maintenance not once in 4 years. Then Gerald had decided to sell. She had understood when the letter came that she was being given notice in the same envelope as the announcement that her home was dissolving. She had taken the letter to her writing table, read it twice, and then returned to the monthly accounts she had been working on, because the accounts still needed to be done, and the letter did not change that fact. She had finished the accounts. She had then begun the methodical process of recording everything, every agreement, every negotiated term, every discrepancy she had repaired and how, in a set of documents she kept separate from the estate files, not as evidence of anything in particular, as the record of work done, because if no one else was going to record it, she was. It was that record, and not the portrait, and not Gerald's careless inventory of the estate contents, that mattered most to her now. She had been earning her own survival for 4 years in a house that had gradually recognized this but had never organized the recognition into anything as concrete as payment or acknowledgement. The person being managed around in any household is often the person keeping the household standing. Eleanor Pembury had managed everything. She had managed it for nothing, and she had not become less than herself, and she was going to take that record with her wherever she went next, even if she was not yet certain where next was. The Duke of Ashford had offices on Grosvenor Square. She had not expected offices. She had expected, she supposed, a drawing room, and a lady who managed his correspondence, and an arrangement that made clear she was a curiosity rather than an appointment. The offices were on the ground floor of his London house, 4 rooms, one with a large table covered in maps and correspondence, one with floor-to-ceiling shelving that held ledgers in a system she could not quite read from the doorway, 2 more she did not see. A man of perhaps 60 sat at a desk near the window and rose when she was shown in. He introduced himself as Mr. Edward Calloway, advisor to the Ashford estate, and he shook her hand as though she were a solicitor rather than a woman in a second-best gray dress. "Miss Pembury," he said, "I understand you managed the Pemberton accounts for approximately 4 years before the estate changed hands." "I managed the Pemberton estate," she said. "The accounts were one part of that." Mr. Calloway nodded. "His Grace will be with you in a moment. In the meantime, would you like to see what we have been working with?" He showed her the Ashford estate accounts for the past 3 years. He did not summarize them or describe them. He simply put them in front of her and let her look. She looked for 11 minutes. She identified 3 patterns of recurring discrepancy in the tenant farm records, and 1 consistent irregularity in the quarterly merchant invoices that did not correspond to the quantities listed in the delivery records. She noted these on the paper she had brought in her bag for exactly this kind of purpose, and did not comment on them yet, because commenting required confirmation, and she had not confirmed. The Duke came in while she was still looking at the 4th ledger. He wore the same dark coat. He looked at her, looking at the ledger, and sat down across the table without speaking, which was, she decided, exactly the right thing to do. "You went straight to the merchant invoices," he said, after a moment. "They did not match the delivery records," she said. "The discrepancy is consistent enough to suggest it is not error." He looked at Mr. Calloway, who looked at Eleanor with the particular expression of someone recalibrating something they had expected to take longer. "We had suspected as much," the Duke said. "We have not been able to document it precisely." "I can document it," she said, "if you can give me the original delivery orders alongside the invoices. Do you have them in one place or separately filed?" "Separately," said the Duke, "currently." "Then we should begin with consolidation," she said. "The discrepancy will be easier to prove once you can see the two records side by side rather than reconstructing the comparison from memory." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Then the Duke said, "Mr. Calloway, would you see to the arrangements for Miss Pembury to have the materials she needs?" It was not a question, quite. It was not quite a job offer either, but it was something. Eleanor pressed one hand briefly against the table's edge, steadying herself against something she was not yet naming. She had managed the Pemberton estate on nothing but the authority of obvious necessity for 4 years. She could manage this. The Duke of Ashford had been inside his own accounts for 2 years before Eleanor Pembury walked into his office and identified a discrepancy in 11 minutes that his 3 previous advisors had failed to name in 18 months. He had not been entirely honest with her at Rylands. He had told her he had found her through the estate records, and this was true, but the fuller truth was that he had employed an inquiry agent, a quiet, thorough man named Fenn, to investigate the Pemberton accounts after Gerald Pembury had attempted to sell him a parcel of the estate's farmland at a price that implied the land had been managed with considerable expertise. Gerald Pembury had not managed anything with considerable expertise. The farmland's value had been built by someone else. Fenn's report had taken 3 weeks and run to 11 pages. On page 4, Fenn had named Eleanor Pembury as the acting manager of the Pemberton estate for the duration of Gerald's tenure. On page 6, Fenn had included the detail that she had renegotiated the wool merchant contracts twice in 4 years, recovering an estimated $400 annually in margin. On page 8, Fenn had noted that the estate filing system bore all the characteristics of design by a single organized intelligence, and that intelligence had not been Gerald Pembury. The Duke had read the report twice. He had then attended the auction at Rylands, not specifically for the portrait, or not entirely, but he had seen it in the catalogue, and he had noted the subject's expression, and the ledger, and the particular quality of attention in the painted face, and he had bid without deliberation, which was unlike him. He was not a man who acted without deliberation. He had been deliberate about nearly everything since his mother died. She had died when he was 22, and he had been 22 for what felt like a long time after, in the specific sense that grief has of stretching the year it occurs across all subsequent years, so that you are always calculating from it. She had been a woman of considerable intelligence who had spent her life managing the Ashford estate's correspondence and social architecture, and 3 different properties' complicated relationships with their tenant farmers, and she had done it without a title or formal authority, because she had her husband's name, and that was considered sufficient instrument for a woman of quality. His father, the previous Duke, was still alive. He lived in the West Wing of Ashford Park and had opinions about management that were 20 years out of date and delivered with the confident volume of someone who had never needed to be correct to be heard. The Duke had been running the estate around his father's opinions for 6 years. It was like navigating around a very large piece of furniture that everyone agreed was inconveniently placed, but no one had the social authority to move. He needed someone who could work in that environment, someone who could manage in the presence of opposition and not become less than herself. Fenn's 11 pages suggested he might have found such a person. The auction at Ryland's suggested she was more than the pages described. He had not been prepared for her to be standing in the room. He had also not been prepared for her to look at the merchant invoices for 11 minutes and then name exactly what had taken his advisors 18 months to suspect. He was prepared for it now. He was making arrangements accordingly, and one of the arrangements involved asking Mr. Calloway to draw up the terms of a formal engagement as a state consultant, with appropriate compensation, which Calloway had done by the following morning, and which the Duke had reviewed and amended once to add a clause that made her documentation rights explicit, because he thought she would care about that, and he was correct. He had also, on the evening after she had left the offices on Grosvenor Square, stood in the corridor outside the music room for 40 minutes, listening to someone play. He had not known she could play. He had not known she was still in the building. She had stayed to consolidate the ledger files, which had taken longer than anticipated, and the housekeeper had offered her the small parlor for supper, rather than send her back to Marylebone at dusk. He had heard the music from the corridor and stopped. It was a piece he recognized. His mother had played it. He stood in the corridor until the piece ended. He did not go in. He was not ready to go in. She was not told about this. But in the morning when she arrived, the music room was unlocked, and the piano had been tuned, and there was a lamp on the side table that had not been there before. Eleanor had been at Ashford's London offices for 2 weeks before she understood that the merchant invoice irregularity was not merely carelessness. It was systematic, and it had a name. And the name was a man called Hutchins, who had been managing the supply contracts for the Ashford estate for 11 years, and had been quietly inflating the invoice quantities since the previous Duke had stopped paying close attention. She documented it in stages, the way she had been taught by the logic of the thing itself. First the pattern, the consistent gap between delivery records and invoiced amounts, always within a range that would not alarm a casual reviewer. Then the source. The invoices were prepared by Hutchins' own office rather than the merchant directly, an arrangement she had noted in week 1 as irregular, and which she had quietly asked Mr. Calloway to explain. Calloway had explained it as historical practice. Eleanor had noted it and continued. Then the total. She added the discrepancies across 11 years of records and arrived at a figure that made her sit very still in the records room for several minutes before she wrote it down. £7,240. She wrote it at the top of a fresh sheet, underlined it, and carried it to the Duke. He was in the estate office. He read the figure and then looked at her, and then looked at the documentation she set on the table beside it, which was 40 pages of organized comparison, invoice against delivery record, year by year, category by category, with the discrepancy total at the bottom of each column. "How long did this take you?" he said. 9 days of the primary review, 3 more of consolidation. I was also working on the tenant farm records simultaneously, so perhaps 11 days total if you count only this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hutchins has been with the estate since before I inherited." "I know," she said. "That does not change the arithmetic." He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, because she had not survived 4 years of Gerald Pembury's management decisions by finching from difficult arithmetic. "No," he said, "it does not." He picked up the first page and read it with attention. She watched him read. He read the way she worked, precisely, without interrupting himself. It was Hutchins himself who precipitated the confrontation. He had been informed, through some channel Eleanor could not trace, that his invoicing records were under review. He appeared at the estate office on a Thursday morning with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned by someone who could not be managed away, and he went around Eleanor entirely, walked past her as she sat at the records table, and addressed himself to Mr. Calloway as though she were a decorative feature of the room. "There has been," Hutchins said, "some confusion about the invoice records. I should explain the filing system. Miss Pembury, said Mr. Calloway, with the calm of someone who had decided a week ago which side of this he was on, "is the person to whom you should address the explanation." Hutchins turned to Eleanor. He had the look of someone who had just stepped on something unexpected in a darkened room. Not exactly alarmed, but recalculating. He was a large man with the settled manner of long institutional authority. "I'm sure," he said, with the particular lightness of a man who did not believe he was talking to anyone who could matter, "that the discrepancies appear concerning to someone not familiar with the system. Supply contracts of this complexity have a certain—" "The complexity," Eleanor said, "is not in the contracts. It is in the invoices which are prepared in your office rather than the merchants. I have the delivery records beside the invoices for each transaction. Would you like to review them, or would you prefer I summarize the total discrepancy first?" There was a silence. Hutchins looked at the stack of documentation on the table. It was a very organized stack. He looked at Eleanor. She waited, her hands flat on the table, her expression the expression of a woman who had a great deal of time and a complete set of primary sources. "I would want to review the specific records," he said, at last, and his voice had lost the particular lightness. "Of course," she said. "Begin with 1811. She turned the stack to face him and opened it to the first page. She was still at the table when the Duke came in at 3 in the afternoon. Hutchins was gone. The documentation was arranged in 3 piles, the confirmed discrepancies, the records requiring final cross-reference, and the documentation she would prepare for the solicitor. Eleanor was working through the second pile. The Duke looked at the 3 piles. He looked at Eleanor. He did not ask what had happened because the 3 piles told a sufficiently clear story. "Hutchins," he said. "He was unable to account for the method of invoice preparation," she said. "I suggested he consult his own records and return. He has not returned." "He will not," the Duke said. "No," she agreed. He sat down at the table, not across from her but beside her, which was not what she had expected. He looked at the pile of confirmed discrepancies. "You should know," he said, "that my father is going to say something unjust about this." She glanced at him. "About Hutchins?" "About you," he said. "He will say that a woman working on his son's accounts is an irregularity he did not consent to, and that Hutchins' mismanagement could have been found by a proper advisor if anyone had looked. And he will not say both of these things simultaneously and see the contradiction. He is not a bad man. He is a man who has not yet been required to look at the contradiction." Eleanor picked up the next page of the cross-reference pile. "I have worked for 4 years in a house where my work was credited to the structure of the house itself," she said. "I am accustomed to having it found by advisors after the fact." He was quiet. Then he said, "I see it." She did not respond immediately. She turned the page, and the next. Then she said quietly, "I know." They worked together in the estate office for 2 hours that afternoon. He did not require explanation of her system. He read the organization as she had built it and followed its logic without asking. She found this, in a way she did not try to name, more sustaining than any compliment she had been paid in 4 years. Lady Cecilia Drummond had been expected to marry the Duke of Ashford since approximately 1815, which was not a formal expectation in the sense of a contract, but was a social expectation of the kind that had more force than most contracts, being reinforced by 3 years of her mother's engineering and 2 of the Duke's own social obligations, and the general understanding of the aristocratic circle that circled the Ashford title like planets around something heavy. Lady Cecilia was beautiful in the way the room understood beauty, arranged, credentialed, precise. She had dark hair and a measured smile, and the social competence of someone who had been trained since childhood to manage rooms, which was not so different from managing estates, except that rooms did not have creditors. She appeared at Ashford House on a Thursday afternoon, 7 weeks after Eleanor had taken up her consulting engagement. with her mother and a purpose that she did not name directly, because naming purposes directly was not how Lady Cecilia operated. She was shown to the drawing room. Eleanor was not in the drawing room. Eleanor was in the records office on the ground floor, working on the tenant farm documentation that she had been restructuring since the Hutchins matter had concluded, which had freed up a considerable amount of her attention for the longer-term problem of the estate's eastern properties, which had been underperforming for 3 years, and which Eleanor had identified as a question of water access, and not, as the previous assessment had suggested, soil quality. Lady Cecilia, on her way to the drawing room, passed through the entrance hall at the same moment that Eleanor was crossing it to retrieve a set of maps from the estate office. The two women looked at each other. "You are," Lady Cecilia said, in the tone of someone identifying a piece of furniture that was in the wrong room, the consulting person. "Miss Eleanor Pembury," Eleanor said. "You are Lady Cecilia Drummond. Good afternoon." Lady Cecilia's gaze moved from Eleanor's face to her hands, which were carrying a rolled set of maps and a ledger, and back to her face. "I was not aware," she said, "that the Duke employed women in this capacity." "He does now," Eleanor said. This was accurate and contained no particular argument, and so Lady Cecilia had nothing to disagree with, except the fact itself, which she could not change in a corridor. She continued to the drawing room. Eleanor continued to the estate office. Lady Cecilia's mother, the Marchioness, cornered Eleanor on the way back 40 minutes later. "Miss Pembury," she said, with the authority of a woman who had been managing people's positions since before Eleanor was born, "I understand you have been very helpful to the Duke in resolving a difficulty with the estate accounts. A great credit to you, I'm sure. I wonder whether you find the work sustainable given the particular nature of the engagement." Eleanor looked at the Marchioness. The Marchioness had the expression of someone who was about to do Eleanor the favor of suggesting she might be happier elsewhere. "The work," Eleanor said, "is progressing well. The Eastern property water access question, in particular, I expect to resolve within the fortnight. Good afternoon, Lady Drummond." She continued down the corridor without waiting to see the expression that followed this. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall as she turned the corner, steadying herself, and then she went back to the maps. She had managed Gerald Pembury and 3 wool merchants and a set of creditors who had not believed an unmarried woman could negotiate a settlement. She could manage a drawing room. The Duke found her in the estate office that evening. He looked at the maps. "The eastern properties," he said. "Water access," she said. "There is a diverted channel about 2 miles north of the boundary that changed course in 1809 or 1810. The tenant farm records show the yield decline began in the following year. It is not the soil. The previous surveyor was looking at the wrong variable." He leaned over the map. He was close enough that she could see the particular quality of his attention. The way he read a map the same way he read a ledger, with the expectation that the information was there if he looked correctly. "If the channel can be redirected," he said. "Partially," she said, "not fully. The original course is built over at the northern end, but sufficient to recover perhaps 60% of the yield differential. I can have a more precise estimate by the end of the week." He straightened. He was looking at her in the way he had been looking at her, off and on, for 7 weeks. The measuring attention that she had noticed at Rylands, and that had not shifted to something easier or more comfortable, as she had half expected it to. It remained precise. "Lady Cecilia was here today," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I passed her in the hall. Her mother spoke with you." "Briefly." He waited. Eleanor did not elaborate, because the elaboration was obvious, and she preferred not to state obvious things when the alternative was silence. "You did not find it distressing," he said. It was almost a question. "Lady Cecilia is the expected candidate," Eleanor said. "I am not." Her mother's comment was an accurate description of the social situation. I do not find accurate descriptions distressing. The Duke looked at the map. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The portrait. Did you choose the ledger, or did Hartley choose it?" She had not been expecting this. "I chose it," she said. "Mr. Hartley asked what I wished to have in the composition. I told him the ledger was the most accurate representation of my daily life. He thought it an unusual choice. My father thought it charming." "Your father was right," the Duke said. And then, because he was not a man who overstated things, he left it at that and returned to the map. She straightened her spine and went back to the water access figures. The figure she had come to by the end of that evening was 63% yield recovery, which she wrote at the bottom of the relevant page in her precise hand and underlined once. His cravat had been crooked for 40 minutes when she told him. She had noticed it when he came in and had not said anything, because it was not her place to say anything. And then 40 minutes had passed and it had remained crooked, and she had watched it with the particular mild irritation of someone who identifies inefficiency and cannot act on it. And finally she said, with her eyes still on the Eastern property map, "Your cravat has been crooked since you arrived." There was a pause. "Has it?" he said. 40 minutes, she said. He reached up and straightened it. "Better?" She looked. "Yes." He said nothing, but he was, when she returned her attention to the map, suppressing something that was not quite a smile, which she noted and filed away. 3 weeks before the quarterly investor council, the Duke's father came to the estate office. The previous Duke, he insisted on the title in conversation, though technically it no longer applied, was a tall man who had been the same height as his son and had given the impression, in his own time, of someone who occupied his position by right of every possible structure of authority. He was 71 now, and carried a cane and walked with the deliberateness of someone who had decided that the slower pace was a choice rather than a necessity. He had the same dark eyes as his son, and none of the son's particular stillness. "I have been told," he said, without preliminary, standing in the doorway of the estate office and looking at Eleanor where she sat at the records table, "that you are the person who has been managing the accounts review." Eleanor rose. "Miss Pembury, Your Grace. I have been engaged as consulting estate manager." The previous Duke looked at the table. He looked at the documentation piled in the organized arrangement Eleanor had maintained for 11 weeks. He looked at her. "My son," he said, "is proposing to bring you to Ashford Park for the Investor Council, to present the accounts review to the full council. I understand that is being considered, yes." "You understand," he said, "that the Investor Council has met for 31 years. There has never been a woman present at its sessions. There has never been a need for a woman to be present at its sessions." Eleanor held his gaze. "There was never," she said, "a need to find £7,000 of unrecorded discrepancy in the estate accounts. It is possible the two facts are related." The silence that followed this was not comfortable. The previous Duke looked at her with the expression of someone who had been told an unpleasant truth in an unambiguous register, and was determining whether to acknowledge it or simply proceed past it. "I shall," he said, finally, "speak with my son." He did speak with his son. Eleanor did not hear what was said. She was in the music room, at the piano, working through a set of fingering exercises she had not had time for in 6 years, because the piano at Pemberton had been sold in Gerald's first round of asset liquidation, and she had missed it in the specific practical way she missed things, by noting its absence and continuing. The Duke's piano was a fine instrument. The music room was warm. She did not usually allow herself to feel the warmth of a room that was not hers. She played one of her mother's pieces. Then, because she was alone and she was not going to pretend she had no grief simply because she was not going to display it, she played it again. Later that evening, the Duke came to the music room doorway and stood there. She heard him arrive and finish the phrase she was in the middle of before she stopped. "He spoke to you," she said. It was not a question. "He did," the Duke said. "He came into the room and sat in the chair near the window, the chair she had come to think of as his chair in this room, because he had sat there each of the 4 times he had come to hear her play. He made his concerns known. They are not illegitimate concerns, taken from within his framework. He believes I disrupt something structural," she said. "Yes, he is correct," she said. "I do." The Duke was quiet. The lamp on the side table lit the room in the particular warm amber that she had come to associate with these evenings, which were the part of the week she found she was increasingly planning around. This was information she kept carefully filed under the category of things she was not yet naming. "The council will convene in 3 weeks," he said. "You will be present. I have informed Mr. Calloway to arrange your credentials." She turned on the piano bench to look at him directly. "You told your father." "I told my father that the person who had found and documented the Hutchins matter and identified the Eastern property water access issue and restructured the tenant farm records would be presenting the accounts review to the council. I told him that her presence was not decorative." He paused. He did not argue with that precisely. He said it was unprecedented. "Many necessary things are," she said. He looked at her with the measuring attention that had never quite shifted into something more comfortable, and she understood, at this moment, that it was not going to shift, because he was not a man who looked at her the way people looked at a curiosity. He looked at her the way he looked at the ledgers, which was to say, with the complete conviction that the information was there, and it mattered, and he was going to read it correctly. "Play again," he said quietly, "if you like." She turned back to the piano. She played the piece she had played twice in private, which was the piece his mother had played, which she had known from her own childhood, and which she had not mentioned to him, because naming it would have required naming what she had heard it mean to him, and she was not ready for that. He stayed for an hour. He did not speak. She did not speak. When she finished and rose, he stood also, and for a moment they were in the same warm room and the same particular proximity, and she pressed her hands flat against the piano lid, and he stood very still. "Eleanor," he said, her name only, first name, no title, a small social liberty he had never previously taken. "Not yet," she said very quietly. "There is still the council." He understood this. He nodded, once, and left the room. She stood at the piano for a long moment after he was gone. Then she picked up her notes from the side table and went back to the Eastern property figures. The Investor Council of the Ashford Estate met in the Great Hall at Ashford Park on a Tuesday in November, with 17 men present and a pale autumn light coming in through the tall windows. The hall was designed to be impressive, and it succeeded. The previous Duke sat at the end of the table closest to the fireplace, as was his custom, in the large chair that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The Duke of Ashford sat at the opposite end, as was current custom, and Eleanor sat to his right with her documentation arranged in front of her. 40 pages of the confirmed Hutchins discrepancy, 14 pages of the Eastern property analysis, and 8 pages of the tenant farm restructuring that had already, in the previous quarter's numbers, produced a 3% yield improvement. The room had looked at her when she was shown in. 17 men with the collective expression of a system encountering an anomaly. Mr. Firth, the lead investor, had looked at the Duke. The Duke had looked at Eleanor, and then at the room and said, simply, "Miss Pemberry is presenting the accounts review today. I recommend close attention." 3 of the 17 men glanced at each other. The previous Duke looked at the ceiling. Eleanor opened the first page. She did not explain herself. She did not introduce her methodology or preface her findings or establish her credentials in the manner of someone who expects to be questioned about whether they have the right to be there. She stated the first finding. She cited the page number. She moved to the second. She had been presenting to difficult rooms in one form or another since she was 19 years old. The wool merchants had not believed she had authority to negotiate. The creditors had not believed she had accurate figures. Gerald Pembury's friends had not believed a woman could manage an estate's recoverable margin. She had sat through all of it, and she had presented the figures, and the figures had been correct. And eventually, everyone in those rooms had arrived at the same place, which was the place where the numbers lived, and there was no alternative to reading them. 23 minutes in, Mr. Firth raised his hand. "Miss Pembury," he said, with the careful tone of someone who was adjusting a position in real time, "the total discrepancy figure on page 4. 7,240 pounds, she said. "Yes, confirmed across all 11 years of records, cross-referenced against the original delivery orders, which are appended at page 31. I can walk you through the cross-reference methodology if you would like, or we can proceed to the Eastern properties." Mr. Firth looked at page 31. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Proceed." She proceeded. The Eastern properties analysis took 12 minutes. She showed the water access maps. She showed the yield differential. She showed the projected recovery timeline and the engineering cost estimate she had commissioned from the surveyor she had sent to the northern boundary 6 weeks ago at a cost of £8, which she had included in the expenses column as a line item. At 41 minutes, she reached the tenant farm restructuring. She presented the 3% yield improvement. She presented the projection for the following 3 years, if the restructuring was maintained. She presented the additional cost of maintaining it, which was $400 annually, against the projected additional yield, which was $1,800 annually. She did not editorialize this arithmetic because the arithmetic did not require editorial. She set down the last page and looked at the room. The room did not erupt immediately. There was a suspended moment in which 17 men looked at 62 pages of organized primary source documentation and made the private adjustments that a room makes when it has been shown something it cannot argue with. Mr. Firth was writing a note. 2 of the men in the middle of the table were leaning together in a murmur that was not, she thought, hostile. The 3 who had exchanged glances at the beginning were looking at the documentation with the particular expression of people rereading something to confirm it said what they thought it said. The previous Duke was looking at his hands. The Duke of Ashford was looking at Eleanor. He stood. The room attended to him, because rooms attended to him, but he was not looking at the room. He was looking at her, and his expression was the most open she had seen it in 11 weeks. Which in a man of his particular containment meant something considerable. "This council," he said, "has been managing the Ashford estate for 31 years. In 31 years, no one has identified the Hutchins discrepancy. No one has questioned the Eastern properties' water access. No one has presented a tenant farm restructuring with a projected 4-to-1 return." He paused. "Miss Pembury has done all 3 in 11 weeks. He looked at the room. Finally, "I would appreciate the Council's recommendations on the Eastern property engineering, but I do not require the Council's opinion on Miss Pembury's engagement. That is settled." Mr. Firth looked at the Duke. Then he looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man adjusting a lever inside himself that was slow but not stuck. "The Eastern property recommendation is sound," Mr. Firth said. "I would move to approve the engineering survey and the associated cost." 4 men seconded, in rapid succession. Eleanor picked up her pen and noted the approval in her ledger. She did not look at the previous Duke until the meeting was nearly concluded, when she glanced toward the fireplace end of the table and found him looking at her. He looked away when her gaze met his. It was not quite acknowledgement. It was the movement of a man who has seen something clearly that he did not expect to see clearly, and who does not yet know what to do with it. She would take that, she decided. She was not going to ask for more than what was there. After the council had concluded and the 17 men were breaking into smaller conversations that had the particular tone of people confirming with each other that they had seen what they thought they had seen, the previous Duke rose from his chair and walked the length of the table to where Eleanor was organizing her documentation. He stood for a moment without speaking, as she waited. "The filing system," he said at last. "My wife used a similar organization. I had not thought about it in some years." He did not say anything else. He turned and walked toward the door, moving with the deliberateness that was not quite a choice and not quite a necessity. Eleanor watched him go. She pressed her hands flat on the documentation and held them there for a moment. Then she straightened the pages into their pile, squared the edges, and placed them in order. The Duke was beside her. He had not moved through the room in the way he usually moved, the room accommodating pace, but had come directly. "Eleanor," he said. The room still had men in it. She was aware of this. "I know," she said, without looking up from the documentation. "No," he said. "I do not mean—" He stopped. He looked at the room briefly, with the expression of a man making a decision about which room he would have preferred to be in. Then he looked back at her. "Will you be in the library this evening? I should like to speak with you properly, without 17 men rearranging their opinions in the background." She looked up at him. His expression was still contained, but the specific quality of the containment had changed. It was the containment of something held rather than something absent. "Yes," she said. "I will be in the library." She arrived before him and was reading, a habit she refused to apologize for, when he came in and closed the door and stood for a moment by the window in the lamplight. The library at Ashford Park smelled of paper and wood and the particular composite of many years of careful preservation, and she had felt comfortable in it from her first evening, which had surprised her. He came to the chair across from hers and sat, and then after a moment he moved from the chair to the floor in front of her, which was not where she had expected him to go. He went on one knee. She looked at him. "I will ask this properly when you prefer," he said, "but I am going to say it tonight, because I do not want to wait, and I have been waiting long enough already." He looked at her with the clear, direct attention that she had first seen at Rylands, and that she now understood was simply how he looked at things he considered to be true and important. "I asked you to come to this estate because you were the best person I had found for the work. That remains true, but it is not why I am asking this. I am asking because in 11 weeks I have become entirely accustomed to your precision and your judgment, and the way you tell me my cravat has been crooked for 40 minutes. I am asking because I do not want to arrange my life around your absence, not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most extraordinary person I have encountered in my adult life, and I have been looking, in a way I did not admit to myself, since long before I attended that auction." Eleanor looked at him for a measured, unhurried moment. She thought about it completely. "Your father," she said, "will not manage this easily." "My father," said the Duke, "recognized your filing system this afternoon as a variant of my mother's. I do not think he will be as unmovable as we have assumed." She thought about that also. Then she said, "Lady Cecilia." "Lady Cecilia is the expected candidate," he said. "I am not choosing the expected candidate." He waited. "I have never chosen the expected candidate." Eleanor set down her book. She looked at him. The dark coat, the precise posture even on one knee, the expression of a man who had made his decision and was waiting for her to make hers. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. She had removed her gloves for reading, and his hand was warm, and held it with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything. "I should also tell you," she said, "that the library catalog has not been updated since 1803, and the East Wing holdings are completely unindexed." "Is that a condition of acceptance?" he said. "It is an observation," she said. but I will need access to the east wing." He was, at last, entirely smiling. "You will have it." They were married in the spring, in the church at the edge of the Ashford Park estate, in a ceremony that was attended by Mr. Edward Calloway, who shook Eleanor's hand again and called her an exceptional practitioner, which was the compliment she kept, by a young woman named Miss Jane Hartwick, who had been at school with Eleanor and who cried freely and indignantly and called it happiness, and by the previous Duke, who stood in the front pew and said nothing objectionable, which Eleanor considered a satisfactory outcome. Lady Cecilia Drummond was not present. She was, by that spring, engaged to a viscount in Wiltshire, and by the following autumn she was managing his household with the considerable social competence she had always possessed, and while Eleanor did not know her well enough to call her content, she appeared to be productively employed, which Eleanor could respect. Mr. Calloway stayed on as senior adviser and learned, over the following 2 years, to treat the new Duchess's recommendations as what they were, which was the most efficient path to a correct outcome. The Eastern Property Water Access Project was completed in 14 months, at a cost 3% under estimate. The yield recovery in the first full season following completion was 67% of the projected differential, 4 points above Eleanor's estimate, which she noted in her ledger with a single underline and the date. The Investor Council met the following autumn with the Eastern property numbers on the table, and approved, unanimously, the restructuring of the tenant farm contracts on the model Eleanor had drafted. Mr. Firth moved the approval. He did not look anywhere in particular when he did it, but he looked at Eleanor when the vote concluded, and the look was not what it had been at the previous meeting. She was working on a different problem by then, the estate's accounting model, which she had been quietly redesigning since the spring, building it into a form that another person could learn and maintain, and which would not require her specific knowledge to function, because she understood that sustainable systems are not built on the irreplaceability of one person. She wrote up the methodology in a document of 22 pages, which Calloway sent to 3 neighboring estates at their request, and which 2 of them adopted within the year, and which was eventually cited, in a report to the Board of Agriculture in 1824, as an example of tenant farm account restructuring, done with what the report called uncommon rigor. The document named the Duchess of Ashford as its author. Their son was born in the 2nd year. They named him Arthur, for her father, with the middle name James, for the Dukes. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's habit of looking slightly past the person in front of him when there was something more interesting happening in the next room, and he was, at 18 months, already pulling himself to standing against the furniture, with the expression of someone who had a great deal to do and was impatient to begin. On an evening in October, when the library was lit and Arthur had been taken to bed twice and had escaped both times, and was now sitting firmly in Eleanor's lap investigating the binding of an estate ledger with total concentration, the Duke sat across from them and watched. Eleanor knew he was watching. She was always aware of when he was watching, a quality she had not expected and had not tried to correct, because it turned out to be an awareness that operated like good architecture, so evenly distributed that you could almost not notice it until you looked for how it worked. She looked up. He was looking at her and Arthur with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not known he was looking for and finds it precisely right. "He is going to tear the binding," Eleanor said. "He is," the Duke agreed. He did not move. She looked down at Arthur, who had located a loose thread in the binding and was following it with the total methodical focus of someone who had identified a discrepancy and intended to trace it to its source. She pressed one hand briefly against his small back, warm, certain, entirely himself, and returned to the account she had been reading, and the lamplight held them all in its circle, and the library was warm, and that was enough, and it was everything.